in the by and by. We'll talk it over, my Lord and I'll ask the reasons, he'll tell me why. When we talk it over in the by and by, I'll hide my heartache behind a smile and wait for reasons till after a while. And though he try me, I know I'll find that all my burdens are silver lined. We'll talk it over in the by and by. We'll talk it over, my Lord and I'll ask the reasons, he'll tell me why. When we talk it over in the by and by, we'll talk it over in the by and by. We'll talk it over, my Lord and I'll ask the reasons, he'll tell me why. When we talk it over in the by and by.
And thank you for that. Turn your Bibles to Genesis chapter 37. When you find your place, we go ahead and stand this evening. Genesis chapter 37. Genesis chapter 37. I'm going to start reading in verse 13. It says, And Israel said unto Joseph, Do not thy brethren feed the flock in Shechem? Come, and I will send thee unto them. And he said to him, Here am I. And he said to him, Go, I pray thee, see whether it be well with thy brethren, and well with the flocks, and bring me word again. So he sent him out of the vale of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. And a certain man found him, and behold, he was wandering in the field. And the man asked him, saying, What seekest thou? And he said, I seek my brethren. Tell me, I pray thee, where they feed their flocks. And the man said, They are departed hence, for I heard them say, Let us go to Dothan. And Joseph went after his brethren, and found them in Dothan. And when they saw him afar off, even before he came near unto them, they conspired against him to slay him. And they said one to another, Behold, this dreamer cometh. Come now, therefore, let us slay him, and cast him into some pit, and we will say some evil beast hath devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams. And Reuben heard it, and he delivered him out of their hands, and said, Let us not kill him. And Reuben said unto them, Shed no blood, but cast him into this pit that is in the wilderness, and lay no hand upon him, that he might rid him out of their hands, to deliver him to his father again. And it came to pass, when Joseph was come unto his brethren, that they stripped Joseph out of his coat of many colors that was on him, and they took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty, there was no water in it, and they sat down to eat bread, and they lifted up their eyes and looked, and behold, a company of Ishmaelites came from Gilead with their camels bearing spicery and balm and myrrh, going to carry it down to Egypt. And Judah said unto his brethren, What profit is it if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh. A real noble thing right here. Let's not kill him. We can make money off him. Come, let us sell him the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh. And his brethren were content, and there passed by Midianites, merchantmen, and they drew and lifted up Joseph out of the pit, and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph into Egypt. And we'll stop there for right now. Let's go ahead and have a word of prayer. Lord, I want to thank you for the time we can have in your word this evening, Lord, and that we can, I think of, as was mentioned, some of the missionaries that we have right now that are still so restricted in what they can and cannot do, and some with new restrictions that are causing that again, Lord. And I thank you for the privilege that we have to be here this evening in your house, Lord. I pray that you'll help us not to take that for granted, Lord. Help us to have learned that that is something we can't take for granted, that we can be here and hear from you, Lord. I pray that you'll bless this time in your word, Lord. I pray that you'll speak through me. I pray this in your name. Amen. You can go ahead and be seated. I'm going to get kind of right into things this evening, trying to get back on our series on You Have a Choice. We've kind of been off for more than a month now. You look at the life of Joseph, and his life is quite the roller coaster ride. He starts out as the favorite child of the favorite wife, and I mean that's starting out pretty good. The Bible makes it pretty clear that his dad played some major favorites. Joseph was loved by his dad more than any of his brothers, and that was not hidden at all. Because of it, he's given special treatment and special gifts. We know of the coat of many colors, where we read when his brothers got him, he was wearing it and they stripped him of it. He had the coat of many colors that I'm sure to his brothers was a slap in their face every time he wore it. I mean, that coat is a symbol of the fact that he is the preferred child. Every time they saw Joseph in that coat or with that coat on, it would have been an insult, a reminder of that he was the favorite, and they hated him for it. We see that real clearly, and I think if we're honest, we can't blame them too much for that. But for Joseph, his life starts on this mountaintop, if you will. Favorite son getting special treatment, but then that roller coaster ride that is his life takes some major lows. The hatred that his brothers have toward him grows, which this is a side note, not the focus of the message, but well worth pointing out. Hatred always grows. If you allow a seed of hatred to sit in your heart, it will always, every time, grow out of control. When they first started to hate their brother, the dreamer as they call him, and the one with the coat of many colors, I am sure at that first instance they didn't imagine they would get to the place of considering murder and selling their brother into slavery. But hatred grows every time. You may not act out exactly how his brothers did, but it'll grow and mess you up if you don't mess with it. That's why learning, and we're going to get to this as the message goes on, but learning to forgive is so important, because people will always do things that upset you. That won't change. Continue with what I've said over and over. People are people. It's not going to change. They're eventually going to do something that upsets you, but you choose how you're going to respond to that. You have to learn to forgive. Joseph's brothers didn't. They didn't. They just allowed that hatred to grow. They just allowed it to keep bothering them and keep building up until this day where we started out that all of a sudden that hatred had reached a boiling point, and here they are out in the field, and they see their brother in the distance, and there's nobody watching them. It's just them, and they see a way we can get away with this. Joseph, who started with some major highs, hits some major lows. He's captured by his own brothers, cast into a pit, which even that, I pointed out that, their whole thing of we'll sell him, so then, we're not killing our own brother. But even Reuben, I mean, his solution to stopping his brothers from murdering Joseph was, let's not kill him. Let's take it down a notch. We're just going to throw him in a hole. He's captured by his brothers, cast into a pit where they then sit at the top and eat their lunch discussing what to do with him. I think we often, when we read passages like this, we read it too fast. We skip over these things. This is what the Bible tells us. That they wanted to kill him. Reuben, being the level-headed brother, says, no, let's not kill him. We'll just throw him in a pit and let him sit there. So they toss him in the pit. The next verse says they sit down to eat bread and discuss their options. I know I'm paraphrasing that, but hold on just a moment. I'll read it to you. Where are we at? I lost my place. Maybe I won't because I can't remember, or I can't see where it is right now. Let's see, verse 24, and they took him and cast him in the pit. And the pit was empty, there was no water in it. Verse 25, so they've just thrown him in the pit. And they sat down to eat bread, and they lifted up their eyes and looked, and behold, the company Ishmaelites. And it goes on from there. They capture him, throw him in a pit, and sit down. Hey, let's have lunch and talk about what we're going to do. Can you imagine, for a minute, Joseph's side here, just for a minute. You go to see your brothers, just obeying what your dad said. It's not like he chose, I'm going to go and rub it into my brothers. No, he was sent here. He was sent by his dad to do this. You just go to see your brothers like you were told to do. They capture you and throw you in a pit and then sit at the top of it and decide and talk about what they're going to do to you next. I mean, that has to be a terrifying experience. I don't know that they were close enough. I have to imagine Joseph sitting in the bottom there and can hear his brothers conspiring about what they're going to do. He didn't know if they would kill him or if they would leave him to starve there or die from the elements. He didn't know if some animal was going to come along. He had no idea what was going to happen to him. And we know what happens from there, but he didn't. His brothers end up selling him as a slave, where he goes to Egypt, serves as a slave, then is falsely accused and thrown in prison, where he is forgotten. He's thrown in prison where he helps these men and then is forgotten. I think to define this part of his life as a low point is a massive understatement. But, like they always do, low times ended, which I think is something we often forget while in a low time. They don't last forever. He goes from this really low time to a huge high again. He's remembered in the prison. He interprets the king's dream and is made second in command of the kingdom. And because of his position, able to save his family and his people from being wiped out by the famine. If you want to talk about a roller coaster of a life, Joseph had it. He knew what the highest of highs were, and he knew what the lowest of lows were. He had some major choices that he had to make along the way. And I want to try and focus on that this evening. I want to focus on three choices that Joseph made. The first choice is Joseph chose to never give up. He chose to never give up. Though at times, I think if we're real honest, at times it would have been the easiest thing to do. When you have hard times, you hit those times where you feel like you're at the bottom, it feels like the easiest thing to do is just to give up. When you hit that, it feels like the easiest thing to do is just to stop trying. You can't see the end in sight. You can't see that light at the end of the tunnel yet, and you're tired of the struggle, so you just think, I want to give up. People do that all the time. We see examples of it all over. People do that in their jobs. If they're going through a difficult patch in their job and they're struggling and they give up, they decide to move on. People do that in their marriages. A lot of marriages fail and fall apart simply because they thought marriage was just fun, but it's work. I was having a conversation about this with someone recently. The whole happily ever after thing is a lie. Like, I don't know who. I love my wife. I do not mean this. She's not here. Nobody go say I said something mean, because I don't mean this negative toward her at all. Please do not take it that way. But opposites attract. And her and I are very much opposites. So you put two people who are opposites in the same house, and it isn't going to be happily ever after. Because there's going to be days that you have to work hard to keep that thing going. And a lot of people hit those tough patches and just stop. It's easier. Give all sorts of examples in places that we do that, whether it's, again, the job, the marriage, or other aspects of life, that things get hard and we hit a low and suddenly, well, we don't want to work at it anymore and we give up. Joseph chose to never give up. May I remind you, he didn't deserve to be there. In the bottom of the pit, he didn't deserve to be there. I know that there were things that he did with telling his brothers the dreams that I've read commentators and heard messages of people, saying, well, he shouldn't have told his brothers the dream. That was just aggravating the situation. I read a commentator this week who said that. Joseph was just trying to aggravate the situation. He knew his brothers didn't like him, so, that was just a little brother doing a little brother thing of just, poking to see if he can get his brothers mad. But he did nothing to deserve to be thrown in this pit. Again, he's here because Dad told him to. The bottom of a pit, he didn't deserve to be there. Sold into slavery, he didn't deserve to be there. It wasn't by his own doing. It wasn't a poor choice that he had made that got him there. He was there by someone else's doing. Enslaved at Potiphar's house, he didn't deserve to be there. That wasn't on him. Thrown into the prison, he didn't deserve to be there. He was falsely accused and thrown into prison for something he didn't do. Most often, when we're in a low spot, it's because we made a poor choice that put us there, or we went out of God's will, or we chose to do something. That wasn't the case in what we're seeing with Joseph. He's in this place and chose not to give up despite the fact that he didn't deserve to be there. Chose not to give up, so what did he do? He worked hard and gave his best. Look at Genesis chapter 39, verse 1 through 6 with me. It says, and Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither, and the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master the Egyptian, and his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. And Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him, and he made him overseer over his house, and all that he had he put into his hand. And it came to pass, from the time that he had made him overseer in his house, and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake, and the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field, and he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he knew not aught he had, save the bread which he did eat, and Joseph was a goodly person and well favored. Now, let's think about this for a minute. Joseph, who is here as a slave in Potiphar's house, and what did he choose to do? He chose to work hard and give it his best. He wouldn't have had to. He wouldn't have had to. Joseph could have had a bad attitude about this entire situation that wasn't his fault anyways. I don't think any of us would have even faulted him for that. Had he just chosen, well, I'm just going to whine about the situation and sit down and cry here and sulk for myself for a while. I don't think we would fault him. I don't think we could fault him. I'm pretty sure if any of us were put in the shoes of Joseph here, we'd sit down and cry for a while. If not literally, we would sure want to. We'd sure inside be whining that this is not right and it's not fair and I don't understand why I'm going through this. But that isn't what we see. We don't see him having a pity party. We don't see him sitting down to whine about his situation. Instead, what we see is that Joseph got up every morning and gave it his best and was blessed for it. He was blessed for it. I know that as I study for this, as I preach it, this point feels more I guess, practical than anything else, but I believe a lesson we can learn from Joseph when in a hard time. Going through a low time, a difficult time of life, he chose not to give up. Just kept pressing on and giving his best. The second thing I want us to look at, Joseph chose to acknowledge God. Let's look at a couple of examples of that. First is in Potiphar's house. We just read chapter 39, verse 1 through 5. I'm not going to have us read it again right now, but in Potiphar's house we see he over and over mentions the Lord was with Joseph and he was prosperous and words it a few different ways. Now, I know that nowhere in those verses, I will call myself out on this. I know nowhere in those verses does it say Joseph specifically acknowledged God for the fact that he was blessed. But why do you think Potiphar saw that the Lord was with him? Why do you think Potiphar saw the Lord was with him? If Joseph didn't verbally say, God's with me, he lived and acted in a way that pointed to his God. Remember, despite being in a low spot of life, despite being sold by his brothers as a slave, despite being in a bad place by no doing of his own, despite being torn from family and everything that he knew, he lived in a way that showed people God. When in a position like Joseph was, that's usually when people see our worst. And when we're in a spot where we're at our lowest and things are the worst, that's typically when people see our worst. Instead, what they saw in Joseph was God. When we traveled with the college, or when my dad was with the college, we traveled with the singing group, and I don't know, that was 22 years ago, somewhere in that ballpark, and it has stuck with me. One of I think it was at a school chapel or something like that, one of the students was giving a lesson, teaching some of the kids, and he gave the example of when you squeeze an apple, what do you get? Apple juice. When you squeeze an orange, what do you get? Orange juice. And, because they're full of that. And then he went to when you squeeze a Christian, what do you get? And what he was going for was Jesus juice. Instead, what he got was a bunch of kids yelling blood and guts. But his goal was, for people to see you get Jesus juice. His example, what he was using it to say was that when a Christian gets squeezed, he ought to be so full of Christ that Jesus juice is what you get. That's what came out of Joseph. He was no doubt getting squeezed in life. But what came out showed people Christ. What came out was not his anger and was not him upset or his attitude about the situation. What came out was showing others Christ. I have to be honest, that's a convicting thought. Because I'm afraid that way too often when we get squeezed, it isn't Christ coming out. Joseph chose to acknowledge God through his actions at Potiphar's house. Second example, he acknowledged God in the prison. Chapter 39, skip down to verse 20 with me. It says, And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in the prison. But the Lord was with Joseph, and he showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison, and whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of. Skip down to chapter 40, verse 7 and 8. And he asked Pharaoh's officers that were with him in the ward of his Lord's house, saying, Wherefore look ye so sadly today? Focus on verse 8 here. He said unto him, We have dreamed a dream, and there is no interpretation or interpreter of it. And Joseph said unto them, Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me them, I pray you. Do not interpretations belong to God? Here Joseph is, again, in a spot where you have to feel like you're just spiraling out of control. You went from living at home with your family, life is good, to your brothers hating you, throwing you in a pit, selling you as a slave. You become a slave and you're falsely accused and thrown into prison. I don't know how many years exactly this spans, but you have to feel like going through all of that your life is spinning out of control. You just keep going from bad to worse. Have you ever had it that you feel like, you take one step forward and two steps back? That was Joseph. I mean, God is blessing him and things are looking okay in Potiphar's house, and then he's falsely accused and thrown in prison. And yet, when given the opportunity, he acknowledges God. Through the way he lives again, we can see that in the fact that as soon as he's in the prison, they recognize that and put him over, but also in his words. When it comes to the dreams, the men worried about the dreams that they had, he immediately brings up God. You think about it, Joseph had options. Joseph could have chosen to ignore them. It's not Joseph's problem that these men had troubling dreams. Realistically, it's not his problem. He could have ignored them. Yeah, okay, they're upset. Not my problem. Someone else can deal with it. We're in prison. We're all troubled. Just get over your dreams. I mean, he could have. He could have ignored the men. He could have tried to take credit for it. He didn't have to tell them that, God is the one interpreting. He could have just said it was him. Instead, he chose to point them to God. He acknowledged God in the prison. We see this again. He acknowledged God in the palace. Look at chapter 41, verse 14 with me. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon, and he shaved himself and changed his raiment and came in unto Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and there is none that can interpret it, and I have heard saying of thee that thou canst understand a dream to interpret it. So Pharaoh is giving him credit so far. Joseph answered Pharaoh and said, it is not in me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Pharaoh was ready to say, hey, no one else can answer it. I've heard you can. He's quick to point out, no, not me. It's not me. It's God. Again, here is Joseph finally in a position, or finally in a moment where it looks like things are moving forward and improving. When the attention's pointed to him, he immediately deflects it off of him and to God. Joseph acknowledged that everything he did, whether he was in a high time or a low time, that everything he did was of God. And he gave God the credit. It's a choice Joseph had to make in all of these cases. He didn't have to give God the credit. He didn't have to acknowledge God in every situation. He could have chosen to have been focused on self, and again, how life wasn't fair and how badly he had been treated. Listen, if anyone can play the victim card, it would have been this man. I mean, if anyone had a right to, it would have been him. But instead of focusing on self, he pointed everything to God. That's a choice he made. Joseph chose not to give up. Joseph chose to acknowledge God. And then lastly tonight, Joseph chose to forgive. Skip over to chapter 45 with me. We're going to read a couple of verses there. Chapter 45, verse 1. I know I'm having you turn to a bunch of different places. I think it's important for us to see this evening, though. Chapter 45, starting in verse 1, it says, And Joseph could not refrain himself before all them that stood by him. All of them are his brothers. And he cried, Cause every man to go out from me. And there stood no man with him, while Joseph made himself known unto his brother. And he wept aloud, and the Egyptians and the house of Pharaoh heard. And Joseph said unto his brethren, I am Joseph. Doth my father yet live? And his brethren could not answer him, for they were troubled at his presence. Joseph said unto his brethren, Come near to me, I pray you. And they came near, and he said, I am Joseph your brother, whom ye sold into Egypt. Now therefore be not grieved, nor angry with yourselves that ye sold me hither. For God did send me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years hath the famine been in the land, and yet there are 5 years in the which there shall neither be earing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve you a posterity in the earth, and to save your lives by great deliverance. Joseph here chose to forgive. He could have held a grudge. Had he been like most of us, had he been like his brothers, would have spent those years dreaming about how he could have gotten revenge. He's spent years getting treatment that he didn't deserve. He had spent time as a slave and a prisoner that was all his brother's fault, and now here they stand. I mean, Joseph could have held a grudge against him. He could have sought revenge. They're here because they need him. They need him. He could have sought for revenge. What they meant for evil, God used for good, and now here Joseph is with power and authority. Joseph had the choice if they got food to take home or not. Realistically, as we saw through this, I know we didn't read all of the passages in between, but as we saw through this, he had the power to decide whether or not they even got to go back home. He had the power that had he wanted, he could have put them through exactly the same thing they put him through. He could have sought some revenge, and again, I think most people would see it as, well, he might have been justified to. I think his brothers expected it. Verse 3, when they had figured out who he was, says that they were troubled. They couldn't even answer him. Because I'm sure they thought, oh no, he's going to seek revenge for everything we put him through. Well, he has the power to do that. But instead of holding a grudge, instead of seeking revenge, he chose to forgive. He chose to forgive. He chose to recognize that God had used this entire situation to put him in the place that he was. That God had used it. I was talking with someone this last week, and it came up at those things that we look back at in life, and we think, well, I would change that if I could do it again. I would do this differently. And kind of where the conversation went is, but those things that we look back and say, well, I would change or I would do differently, are what has made us who we are. All of us, I think, have things that we look back at and think, well, if I could do that again, I would do it differently. Or maybe we look at some painful experience in our past, and we think, well, I wish I wouldn't have had to have gone through that. I wish I could do things again, and I would maybe handle this situation differently. But what you've come through, what God has brought you through, is what has made you who you are today. Did you ever think that perhaps God brought you through it for a purpose? That perhaps it was to put you in a place that he could use you? Joseph got that. You notice, even in talking to his brothers, he pointed to God. It wasn't what you put me through. It was God placed me here. But for that to happen, you have to choose to forgive. Choose to recognize that God brought you through it for a purpose, his purpose. Conclusion this evening, here's how I want to kind of try and wrap all this together tonight. Joseph went through some extremely hard times. There is no other way to put it. He went through some extremely difficult things, but he chose not to give up. He just kept pushing on, and he chose to acknowledge God in everything that he did, and he chose to forgive and recognize it was all a part of God's plan. And here's how I want to try to help us apply this evening. We all go through what we would consider some low times in life. Maybe some are going through them now. Maybe it's something that happened in the past. Maybe it's something someone did to you. But you have a choice. You have a choice. You have the choice to sit down and whine or keep pushing on. You have the choice to acknowledge God in everything. And you have the choice to hold a grudge or forgive. Let's choose to recognize simply that it's all part of God's plan. Let's choose to recognize that it's all part of God's plan. Let's get to the point where we can, like Joseph in verse 7, God sent me before you to preserve for you a posterity in the earth. Choose to recognize it wasn't what somebody did. It wasn't any of that. It was God had a plan. And recognize He has you where you are for a purpose. Let's pray. Lord, I want to thank you for the fact that you do have a plan, a purpose. I think it's so easy for us when we're going through those low times to forget that, to get focused on what the problem is, or to get focused on maybe who hurt us or who we blame for this, rather than acknowledging you like Joseph did over and over and seeing you're bringing us through this for a reason. It's to bring us to where you can use us. Lord, help us to submit to that. Lord, help us to realize when we're in those difficult times, those low times of life, that we have the choice to sit down and whine or keep pushing on for you. Help us to realize when in those low times that we have the choice to acknowledge you in everything. And we have the choice whether we're going to hold a grudge or forgive. Praise in your name.